The teacup shook in Clara's hand the moment the carriage wheels stopped crunching on the gravel outside Ashworth Hall. Margaret grabbed her sister's wrist and hissed at her to be still, but it was too late. A drop of tea had already spilled onto the white tablecloth, spreading like a small brown wound. Mrs. Ashworth saw it from across the drawing room and her face went pale. She rushed forward, snatched a napkin, and pressed it to the stain as if she could stop time itself from moving forward. Outside, footsteps sounded on the stone steps. The Duke of Cavendon had arrived. For 3 days the household had done nothing but prepare for this single afternoon. The good china had been taken from storage and washed twice. The rugs had been beaten until the maid's arms ached. Lord Reginald Ashworth had walked the halls muttering about debts and dowries, and Mrs. Ashworth had drilled her 3 daughters on posture, conversation, and the correct way to laugh at a gentleman's joke without seeming too eager or too cold. Everything depended on this visit. The family's fortune had been sinking for years, quietly at first, then faster, like a boat with a slow crack in its hull. A marriage to a duke, even a distant and difficult one, would be enough to save them all. Hannah Foss did not think about any of this as she carried the silver tray toward the drawing room. She thought only of not spilling the tea, of keeping her steps even, of making sure her apron was clean and her cap was straight. She was 17 years old and had worked in the Ashworth household since she was 12, first in the kitchen, then as a housemaid, and now, because the regular parlor maid had taken ill, she had been given the task of serving tea to a duke. She had never spoken to a duke before. She had never spoken to anyone above the rank of a country solicitor. Her hands were steady only because she forced them to be steady, the way she forced herself to remain calm during every hard moment of her life so far. The drawing room fell silent when the Duke entered. Julian Ashcombe was not what Hannah had expected. She had imagined someone old, someone with a stiff neck and a bored expression, someone who would look at the room and find it wanting. Instead, she saw a man who could not have been older than 30, with dark hair that had not been perfectly combed, and eyes that moved carefully over everything, missing nothing. He bowed to Lord and Mrs. Ashworth. He greeted Margaret, Charlotte, and Clara with polite words that gave nothing away. Then he sat down in the chair that had been prepared for him, the best chair in the house, angled so the afternoon light would fall kindly on whichever daughter sat across from him. Mrs. Ashworth began to speak at once, filling the silence with talk of the weather, the journey from London, the beauty of the county in early summer. The Duke answered when he had to and said nothing more than was required. Hannah stepped forward with the tray. She had been taught exactly how to do this. Approach from the left, pour with the spout facing away from the guest. Never let the cup rattle against the saucer. She had practiced it 100 times in the kitchen with an old chipped cup that cook let her use. She reached the Duke's side and lowered the tray slightly so he could see the cup. She poured, and her hand did not shake, though her heart was beating so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. The Duke looked up at her. It was only a glance, the kind of glance a gentleman might give any servant, quick and forgettable. But then his eyes stayed a moment longer than they should have. Hannah felt the heat rise in her face and looked down immediately, finishing the pour, stepping back, moving on to the next person as she had been trained to do. She did not see the way the Duke's gaze followed her across the room. She did not see the small line that appeared between his brows, as if he had noticed something he had not expected to notice. Margaret cleared her throat and began speaking about a book she claimed to have just finished, a long and difficult novel that Hannah happened to know Margaret had never actually opened. The Duke nodded politely, but his answers were short. Charlotte tried next, complimenting the Duke's estate, which she had never visited, using details she had clearly memorized from a magazine article. The Duke thanked her without enthusiasm. Clara, the youngest, seemed too nervous to say much at all. She smiled when spoken to and looked at her mother for guidance every few seconds, like a small bird checking for danger before it dared to eat. Hannah continued around the room, filling cups, offering sugar, stepping back into the shadows near the wall where servants were meant to remain, present but invisible. She watched the family's performance with the detached interest of someone who had seen many performances before, though never one quite so desperate as this. She noticed things the family did not seem to notice about themselves. She noticed that Margaret's laugh, meant to sound light and carefree, came out forced and too loud. She noticed that Charlotte kept glancing at the Duke's clothing, calculating its cost, and that the calculation showed plainly on her face if one knew where to look. She noticed that Clara's hands trembled in her lap, and felt, despite everything, a small flicker of sympathy for the girl, who seemed more frightened than ambitious. The Duke asked a question about the local church, and Lord Ashworth answered at great length, using the opportunity to mention several other families of note in the area. weaving in comments about connections and old friendships that Hannah suspected were not nearly as close as he claimed. Through it all, the Duke's attention kept drifting toward the wall where Hannah stood. It happened again when she came forward to refill his cup. This time he spoke. "Thank you," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it clearly. Hannah was so surprised that she nearly missed the pour entirely. Servants were not thanked. They were expected, useful, present, but rarely acknowledged with actual words. She managed a small nod and murmured something polite, before retreating again, her pulse quick in her throat. Mrs. Ashworth had heard the exchange, though not the words themselves, and her eyes narrowed slightly as she watched the maid step back. She said nothing, but Hannah felt the weight of that look land on her shoulders like a stone. The visit continued for another hour. The Duke asked polite questions of each sister in turn, questions about their interests, their reading, their opinions on subjects that seemed designed more to test their character than to truly learn anything about them. Margaret answered with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Charlotte answered with careful flattery. Clara answered in short, anxious sentences, always glancing toward her mother. When the Duke asked what each of them thought made a person truly happy, Margaret spoke of position and comfort. Charlotte spoke of a fine home and a respected name. Clara hesitated so long that her mother finally answered for her, speaking of family and duty in a way that sounded rehearsed because it was. The Duke's gaze moved once more to the wall, as if he wondered, just for a moment, what answer the quiet maid standing there might have given, had anyone thought to ask her. He did not ask her. It would have been improper, unthinkable, a thing that simply was not done. But the thought crossed his face for half a second before he turned back to the family and continued the conversation as expected. At last the visit drew to a close. The Duke rose, thanked the family for their hospitality, and said he hoped to call again before he returned to London. Mrs. Ashworth nearly wept with relief and delight, already imagining the wedding, the alliance, the rescue of the family name. As the Duke walked toward the door, he passed close to where Hannah stood. He paused, only for a moment, and looked at her directly, not with the polite blindness gentlemen usually gave to servants, but with real attention, as if he were trying to memorize something. "What is your name?" he asked. The room seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Ashworth's smile froze on her face. Margaret's eyes flicked sharply toward Hannah. Charlotte's mouth opened slightly in surprise. Hannah's throat felt dry. She had never been asked her name by anyone of such rank. She lowered her eyes as she had been taught, though something in her wanted to look at him directly instead. "Hannah, my lord," she said. "Hannah Foss." The Duke nodded once, as if fixing the name carefully in his memory. "Thank you for the tea, Hannah Foss," he said. "It was the best I have had in a long while." Then he continued toward the door, bowed once more to the family, and left. The silence he left behind was heavier than any that had come before it. Mrs. Ashworth turned slowly to look at Hannah, and there was nothing warm in her expression now, only calculation, sharp and cold, the same look she gave the household accounts when they did not balance. Hannah understood, in that instant, that something in her life had just changed, though she could not yet say whether it was for better or worse. She only knew that the eyes of every person in that room were now fixed on her, and that none of those eyes, save perhaps Clara's, held anything close to kindness. Hannah gathered the empty cups onto her tray and carried them toward the kitchen, grateful for the excuse to leave the room. Her hands were not quite steady now, though the danger of spilling anything had passed. She felt the strange weight of having been seen, truly seen, by someone whose gaze usually passed over people like her without pausing at all. In the kitchen, Cook looked up from the stove and asked how the visit had gone. Hannah opened her mouth to answer and found she did not know what to say. She settled for telling Cook that the family had been very nervous and that the Duke had seemed quiet, which was true enough, though it left out the one detail that mattered most. She did not mention that he had asked her name. She did not mention the way he had looked at her or the strange warmth that had spread through her chest when he thanked her for the tea. It felt like something private, something that belonged only to her, and she was not ready to share it, not even with Cook, who had been kind to her since the day she first arrived at Ashworth Hall as a frightened child of 12. Upstairs, the mood in the drawing room had shifted entirely. Margaret paced by the window, her arms crossed, replaying the visit in her mind and searching for the moment things had gone wrong. Charlotte sat very still, her expression carefully composed, though her eyes followed her mother with a question she did not dare ask aloud. Clara sat quietly in the corner, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers, relieved that the ordeal was over, and uncertain what to make of the strange ending. Mrs. Ashworth stood at the center of the room, her mind working quickly behind a face that had gone smooth and unreadable. She had spent years learning to hide her true thoughts in front of her daughters, and she used that skill now, though inside she was already forming a plan. A duke did not ask a maid's name without reason. She had seen enough of the world to know that much. It could mean nothing. It could mean everything. She intended to make certain it meant nothing at all. "He will call again," she said finally, breaking the silence. Dukes are curious men. It is nothing more than that. No one in the room quite believed her, though none of them said so. Lord Ashworth, who had remained near the fireplace through most of the exchange, cleared his throat and remarked that the visit had gone well enough, all things considered, and that they should not read too much into a single strange moment. He was a man who preferred not to look too closely at problems until they could no longer be avoided, and he retreated now into that same comfortable blindness, already thinking ahead to how he might describe the visit to his creditors as a promising sign of things to come. Outside, the Duke's carriage rolled down the long drive, past the hedges and the old stone gate, and turned onto the road that led back toward the inn where he was staying for the length of his visit to the county. He sat alone in the carriage, looking out at the passing fields without truly seeing them, his thoughts caught on a moment that should have meant nothing at all. He had met 3 young women that afternoon, each presented to him with obvious purpose, each performing a role she had clearly rehearsed. He had met such women before, in London drawing rooms and country houses alike, and he had grown weary of the performance long ago. What he had not expected was to find himself thinking, hours later, not of any of the 3 sisters, but of the quiet maid who had poured his tea without once trying to impress him. There had been nothing calculated in her manner. She had not smiled too widely or laughed too easily. She had simply done her work, carefully and well, and when he had spoken to her, she had answered honestly, without artifice. It was, he realized, the first honest moment he had experienced in that house all afternoon. He did not know what to make of the fact that it troubled him, or that he found himself already looking forward to seeing Ashworth Hall again, for reasons that had nothing to do with the 3 daughters he had been sent there to consider. Behind him, in the house full of daughters who had been presented and hopes that had been built and rearranged in a single afternoon, a maid stood quietly in the kitchen, drying teacups with careful hands, unaware that a duke was already thinking of her name. The letter arrived 3 days later, carried by a rider in fine livery, and Mrs. Ashworth tore it open with hands that trembled from excitement rather than fear. The Duke intended to call again, this time for an entire afternoon, and he had asked that the family arrange a small gathering so he might come to know them better. The house exploded into motion the moment the news spread. Margaret insisted on a new gown. Charlotte demanded that the good silver be polished twice instead of once. Clara asked quietly whether she truly had to attend, and was told, sharply, that of course she did. Hannah heard the news from Cook, who mentioned it while kneading bread, her voice carrying the same excitement as everyone else in the house, though for entirely different reasons. A second visit meant more work, more polishing, more hours on her feet, and Hannah expected nothing else from it. She did not expect to be told, the following morning, that she would again be serving refreshments during the visit. Mrs. Ashworth delivered this instruction herself, standing in the doorway of the small room where the servants took their meals, her expression carefully neutral. "You did well enough last time," she said, though her tone suggested this was more accusation than compliment. "You will do the same again, nothing more. Do you understand me, Hannah?" Hannah understood perfectly. She was to be present, useful, and invisible, exactly as before. She nodded and said she understood, and Mrs. Ashworth left without another word, though she paused at the door and looked back once, a long, searching look that made Hannah feel as though she had already done something wrong simply by existing. The day of the visit arrived warm and bright, the kind of early summer day that made the gardens at Ashworth Hall look their very best, roses climbing the old stone walls and bees moving lazily between the flower beds. The family gathered in the drawing room an hour before the Duke was expected, going over their positions and their planned conversation topics as though preparing for a battle rather than a social call. Margaret had chosen a gown of deep blue that she believed made her look older and more sophisticated. Charlotte wore pale yellow, a color she had been told suited her complexion, though in truth it made her look slightly ill in the strong afternoon light. Gara wore a simple pale green dress that her mother had chosen for her, one that made her look even younger and more uncertain than usual. When the Duke's carriage arrived, the family arranged themselves in the drawing room exactly as they had planned, each daughter positioned to catch the best light, each prepared with a topic of conversation designed to showcase her particular talents. Julian Ashcombe entered the room and greeted the family with the same polite reserve he had shown during his first visit. But Hannah, standing near the wall with the tea tray already prepared, noticed something different this time. His eyes moved across the room quickly, almost searching, before settling on the family and offering the expected courtesies. She recognized what he was looking for, though she told herself firmly not to think too much of it. The visit began with Margaret, as the eldest, taking the lead in conversation. She had prepared extensively, having borrowed a book of poetry from a neighbor specifically to discuss with the Duke, believing this would demonstrate both her intelligence and her refined taste. She launched into an analysis of several poems with practiced confidence, quoting lines she had memorized the night before. The Duke listened politely, asked a single question about her opinion of one particular poem, and seemed unsatisfied when her answer revealed that she had memorized the words without truly understanding their meaning. He did not say this aloud, of course. He simply nodded and allowed the conversation to move forward, though something in his expression suggested he had noticed the gap between performance and genuine feeling. Charlotte tried a different approach, steering the conversation toward his estate, his properties, his position in society, questions disguised as polite interest but transparent in their true purpose. The Duke answered these questions briefly and without enthusiasm, clearly recognizing the calculation behind them. Clara, when her turn came, could barely manage more than a few words before falling silent, overwhelmed by the pressure of the moment. Her mother stepped in quickly, filling the silence with talk of Clara's accomplishments, her needlework, her gentle nature, though the girl herself seemed to shrink further into her chair with every word. Hannah moved through the room quietly, offering tea and small cakes, staying as much in the background as possible. She had been careful, since the moment Mrs. Ashworth spoke to her that morning, to keep her eyes down, to move efficiently, to give the Duke no reason to notice her at all. It seemed the wiser course, given the way Mrs. Ashworth had watched her afterward. But careful plans have a way of falling apart in small, unexpected moments. It happened when Hannah reached to refill Lord Ashworth's cup, and her sleeve caught the edge of a small side table, knocking loose a folded newspaper that had been resting there. She caught the tray with one hand, kept the teapot from spilling, but the newspaper slid to the floor with a soft slap, and in her effort to catch it before it fell entirely, she dropped one of the small cakes from the tray as well. The room's attention shifted to her immediately. Mrs. Ashworth's face tightened with visible displeasure. Margaret let out a small, sharp laugh, quickly hidden behind her hand. Charlotte simply stared, her expression cool and faintly satisfied, as though she had been waiting for exactly this kind of mistake. Hannah felt her face grow hot with embarrassment. She knelt quickly to retrieve the fallen cake and the newspaper, murmuring an apology, her movements now less steady than before, exactly the opposite of the composure she had worked so hard to maintain. "There is no need to apologize," the Duke said. His voice was calm, and it cut through the room's tension in a way that surprised everyone, including Hannah herself. She looked up, still kneeling, and found him watching her with an expression that held no judgment at all, only mild concern, as though he were more worried that she might have hurt herself than troubled by the small disruption. "It was only a cake," he continued, and though he did not smile outright, there was something almost warm in the way he said it, a lightness that none of his previous words that afternoon had carried. "I believe the household will survive the loss." A ripple of surprised, uncertain laughter passed through the room, though it came mostly from Lord Ashworth, who seemed relieved to have an excuse to laugh at anything. Mrs. Ashworth's smile looked pinned to her face, forced and thin. Hannah rose, retrieved the tray, and murmured her thanks before retreating again toward the wall, her heart pounding harder than the small accident warranted. She busied herself with rearranging the remaining cakes, grateful for something to do with her hands, and did not look up again for a long while. The conversation resumed, though the mood in the room had shifted slightly, as though the small accident had cracked something open, some careful arrangement that had been holding the afternoon together. Margaret tried to steer things back toward the poetry discussion, but the Duke's attention seemed harder to hold now, his answers shorter, his eyes drifting occasionally toward the wall where Hannah stood. Later, when the family moved out into the garden for a walk, as had been planned, Hannah was sent ahead with a smaller tray of refreshments to arrange on a table near the roses, where the family intended to sit and continue their conversation in the pleasant afternoon air. She was setting out the cups when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find the Duke had walked ahead of the rest of the group, arriving at the garden table alone. "Miss Foss," he said, and the formal address startled her nearly as much as his sudden appearance. Servants were rarely addressed with such courtesy. "Your Grace," she dropped into a small curtsy, keeping her eyes lowered, though she was intensely aware of him standing only a few feet away. "You need not do that," he said. "Not out here, where no one else can see." Hannah straightened slowly, uncertain what to make of this. "It is not my place to decide when courtesy is required, Your Grace." "Perhaps not." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something searching in his expression, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle he could not quite name. "You handled today's small mishap with grace." Most people, faced with an audience like that one, would have made a much larger scene of it. "I have had a great deal of practice remaining calm, Your Grace." The words came out before she could soften them, and she immediately worried they sounded too bold for a servant to speak to a duke. But he laughed, quietly, a real laugh, brief and unguarded. "I imagine you have." Voices drifted closer from the direction of the house, the rest of the family approaching along the garden path. The Duke glanced toward the sound, then back at Hannah, and something in his expression grew more careful, more controlled, as though he were closing a door that had briefly stood open. "Thank you for the tea, Miss Foss," he said, his voice returning to its earlier formal tone. As before, it was excellent. He turned and walked back toward the approaching family, leaving Hannah standing alone by the table, her pulse still unsteady, her mind turning over every word of the brief exchange, as though searching for some hidden meaning she might have missed. She did not have long to consider it. The family arrived moments later, and the afternoon continued much as before, with Margaret and Charlotte competing for attention, and Clara sitting quietly at the edge of the group. But Hannah noticed, throughout the remainder of the visit, that the Duke's eyes returned again and again to the garden table where she stood, and that Mrs. Ashworth noticed it too, her expression growing colder with each small glance. By the time the Duke's carriage departed that evening, the sun beginning to lower over the hills beyond the estate, Hannah understood that whatever had begun during his first visit had not faded. If anything, it had grown, quietly, in ways that frightened her nearly as much as they filled her with a feeling she did not yet have a name for. That night, lying in the small room she shared with two other maids, Hannah stared at the ceiling, and told herself firmly that nothing could come of it. Dukes did not marry maids. Dukes did not even notice maids, not truly, not in any way that mattered. Whatever strange attention Julian Ashcombe had shown her was surely nothing more than passing curiosity, the kind of thing that would fade the moment he returned to London and resumed his proper life among people of his own rank. She believed this, or told herself she believed it, right up until she fell asleep and dreamed, despite her best efforts, of a garden full of roses and a voice that had called her Miss Foss, as though she were someone worth noticing after all. In the drawing room downstairs, long after the last candle had been carried up to the family bedrooms, Mrs. Ashworth remained seated by the cold fireplace, turning the events of the afternoon over in her mind with the same careful attention she gave to the household accounts. She had watched her daughters fail, one after another, to hold the Duke's genuine interest, and she had watched, with growing unease, the way his attention kept drifting toward a servant girl who had done nothing more than pour tea and drop a cake. It was not supposed to happen this way. She had raised her daughters for exactly this purpose, had spent years teaching them the proper accomplishments, the correct manners, the delicate art of appearing interesting to a man of consequence without appearing too eager. She had done everything expected of a mother in her position, and yet somehow a maid with no education, no fortune, and no name worth mentioning had managed, without even trying, to capture the attention that Margaret, Charlotte, and Clara had worked so hard to win. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes were known to be eccentric, to find brief amusement in unlikely places before returning, always, to matches that made sense. Julian Ashcombe would grow tired of whatever curiosity he felt, and turn his attention back to where it belonged, toward a daughter of good family who could bring him the connections and respectability his position required. Still, she resolved that night to be more careful. Hannah Foss would not serve tea during the next visit, whenever it came. She would find some other task to occupy the girl, somewhere far from the drawing room, far from the garden, far from any chance of another accidental meeting. It was a small precaution, she told herself, nothing more than good sense. The kind of quiet correction a sensible woman made when she noticed something drifting slightly off course. Upstairs, in the room she shared with her sisters, Charlotte lay awake long after Margaret's breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of sleep. She could not stop thinking about the moment in the garden, the way the Duke had walked ahead of the group, the few minutes he had spent alone before the rest of them arrived. She had not been able to hear what was said, but she had seen his face when he returned, had seen something in his expression that unsettled her deeply, though she could not quite name what it was. She told herself it was nothing. A duke did not choose a maid over a lady, regardless of how the afternoon had unfolded. Such things simply did not happen, not in the world she had been raised to understand, where rank and fortune determined every important outcome, where a girl like Hannah Foss existed to serve, not to be noticed, let alone admired. And yet the thought lodged itself in her mind and would not leave, growing sharper and more uncomfortable with each hour she lay awake, until she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with vague, troubling dreams she would not remember clearly by morning, though the feeling they left behind, a mixture of jealousy and fear, lingered long after she woke. In the small servants' quarters at the far end of the house, Hannah slept more peacefully than either Mrs. Ashworth or Charlotte, unaware of the quiet calculations already being made against her. She had no way of knowing that her simple presence in a garden, her honest answer to a simple question, had set something in motion that she would not be able to stop, no matter how carefully she tried to remain in the background where she believed she belonged. Morning would bring new instructions, new restrictions, and a household growing more watchful with every passing day. But for one more night, Hannah slept without fear, dreaming only of roses and a voice that had, for a few unguarded minutes, treated her as though she mattered. The wooden spoon cracked against the edge of the mixing bowl so hard that Hannah nearly dropped it. Cook had never struck anything in anger before, not in all the years Hannah had worked beside her, and the sound made every maid in the kitchen freeze where she stood. "Mrs. Ashworth wants you scrubbing the cellar stairs today," Cook said, not meeting Hannah's eyes. All day, she was very clear about it. Hannah set down the bowl she had been holding and wiped her hands on her apron. The cellar stairs had not been scrubbed in months, not because they needed it more than any other part of the house, but because the task was long, unpleasant, and required kneeling on cold stone for hours at a time. It was the kind of work given to a maid who had displeased someone, and everyone in the kitchen understood exactly why the order had been given, even if no one said it aloud. It had been a week since the Duke's second visit. In that time, Hannah had noticed a steady stream of changes to her duties. She was no longer permitted anywhere near the family's private rooms. She had been reassigned from serving meals to washing linens. Small tasks that had once been shared among the maids now fell to her alone, tasks chosen, she suspected, specifically because they kept her far from any room the Duke might visit should he call again unexpectedly. She did not complain. Complaining was not something a maid in her position could afford, and besides, she told herself the extra work would pass in time, once Mrs. Ashworth's suspicions faded. Once the family understood there was truly nothing to fear from a servant girl who wanted nothing more than to keep her position and stay out of trouble. But the suspicions did not fade. If anything, they grew sharper with each passing day, and Hannah began to understand that Mrs. Ashworth's watchfulness was not born of simple caution. It was fear, real and deep, the fear of a woman who had staked her family's entire future on a marriage that now seemed threatened by something she could not control or fully explain. The cellar stairs took most of the morning. Hannah knelt on the cold stone, scrubbing at years of grime with a brush that wore blisters into her palms, and tried not to think about the ache spreading through her knees and back. She thought instead about her mother, who had died when Hannah was 10, and about the promise she had made to herself afterward, that she would work hard, keep her head down, and build some kind of stable life for herself, even without family, even without fortune, even without the things other girls took for granted. She had never expected a Duke to complicate that plan. She finished the stairs by midday and was given no time to rest before being sent to help with the laundry, an enormous task that involved carrying heavy baskets of wet linens out to the drying lines and back again throughout the afternoon. By the time evening arrived, her arms ached from her shoulders to her fingertips, and she was more grateful than she had been in years to finally sit down for the evening meal in the small servants' dining room. It was there, halfway through a bowl of thin soup, that she overheard Charlotte's voice drifting down from the hallway above, carrying more clearly than the young woman likely intended. "She is nothing," Charlotte was saying to someone, though Hannah could not tell who. "A maid with no family worth mentioning. It is absurd to even think of it. Mother is right to keep her away." A second voice, quieter, that Hannah recognized as belonging to one of the upstairs maids, murmured something in response that Hannah could not make out. "Of course she noticed him looking," Charlotte continued, her voice sharpening. "Everyone noticed. But looking is not the same as choosing. He will come to his senses soon enough, once he remembers what is expected of a man in his position." The voices moved further away, and Hannah lost the rest of the conversation, though she had heard enough to understand clearly what she had already suspected. The family was not merely being cautious. They were actively working to make certain nothing could grow from whatever had begun during the Duke's visits, and Charlotte, at least, seemed determined to play an active role in that effort. Hannah finished her soup without tasting it and returned to her small room early that night, though sleep came slowly, her mind circling back again and again to the conversation she had overheard. to the cold certainty in Charlotte's voice, to the growing sense that her position in the household, once simply modest and unremarkable, had become something dangerous. The following days brought no relief. Mrs. Ashworth found reason after reason to keep Hannah occupied with the hardest, most exhausting tasks in the house, always phrased as ordinary duties, never explained, though everyone understood the reasoning behind them. Margaret, who had shown little interest in Hannah before, began watching her with open suspicion whenever their paths crossed in the halls. Even Clara, usually gentle and quiet, seemed to avoid meeting Hannah's eyes now, as though uncertain how to behave around a servant who had somehow become the center of so much tension in the house. It was nearly 2 weeks after the second visit when word arrived that the Duke intended to call again, this time to invite the family to walk the grounds of a nearby estate he had recently begun renting for the length of his stay in the county, a property with gardens said to rival those of much grander homes. The household once again fell into a flurry of preparation, though this time Hannah was given no role in it at all. She was informed, flatly, by Mrs. Ashworth herself, that she would spend the day of the visit working in the far kitchen garden, weeding and tending vegetables, a task that would keep her occupied and, more importantly, entirely out of sight. Hannah accepted the instruction without protest, though something in her chest tightened at the clear message behind it. She told herself this was for the best. Whatever strange attention the Duke had shown her during his visits could only lead to trouble, for herself as much as for the family. It was safer, wiser, to simply disappear from his notice entirely and let the natural order of things reassert itself. The morning of the visit arrived bright and warm, and Hannah made her way out to the kitchen garden as instructed, kneeling in the soil between rows of vegetables, pulling weeds with steady, practiced hands. The garden was far enough from the house that she could not see the drive or hear the sounds of the Duke's arrival, and she told herself this distance was a mercy, a chance to simply do her work without the complications of the past 2 weeks pressing on her thoughts. She had been working for perhaps an hour when she heard footsteps on the garden path behind her. She turned, expecting one of the other maids sent to check on her progress, and found instead the Duke himself standing at the edge of the vegetable rows, dressed simply for the day's planned walk, looking entirely out of place among the cabbages and beans. "Your Grace." Hannah scrambled to her feet, brushing soil from her apron, her heart suddenly racing. "You should not be here. The family is expecting you at the house." "I know," he said, and there was something almost sheepish in his expression, an admission that he had done something he perhaps should not have. "I asked to see the gardens before the walk began, and I was told the kitchen garden lay this direction. I confess I was curious whether I might find you here." Hannah glanced anxiously toward the house, visible in the distance beyond a low hedge, and felt a fresh wave of alarm at the thought of Mrs. Ashworth discovering this conversation. "Your Grace, if you are found here, speaking with me, it will only make matters worse. Please, you should return to the house before you are missed." "Worse for whom?" His voice had grown quieter, more serious. "For me." The words came out more honestly than she intended, and she immediately wished she could take them back. "The family has already grown suspicious. If they believe you sought me out deliberately, I will lose my position. I have nowhere else to go, Your Grace. This work is all I have." Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a flicker of genuine concern replacing the earlier lightness. "I did not consider that my attention might cause you harm," he said slowly. "I have been thoughtless." "You have been kind," Hannah said, softer now. "But kindness from a man of your position can be dangerous for someone in mine, even when it is not intended that way." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "I have met a great many young women since I came of age," he said finally. "Women presented to me by their families, each one polished and prepared, each one saying exactly what she believes I wish to hear. I have grown so accustomed to it that I had nearly forgotten what an honest conversation felt like, until you nearly dropped a cake on my boots and apologized as though the fate of the nation depended on it." Despite herself, Hannah felt the corner of her mouth lift into something close to a smile. "I am glad my clumsiness amused you, Your Grace." "It did more than amuse me." He took a small step closer, then seemed to catch himself, glancing again toward the house, as if remembering the risk she had described. "I should return before I cause you further trouble, but I wanted you to know that my attention, whatever you choose to call it, is not idle curiosity. I find myself thinking of you far more than propriety would suggest is wise." Hannah did not know how to answer this. Her heart pounded with something that felt dangerously close to hope, though she pushed the feeling down immediately, reminding herself of everything Charlotte had said, everything Mrs. Ashworth's cold glances had communicated without words. "Your Grace," she said carefully, Nothing good can come of this. You know that as well as I do. Perhaps, he said. Or perhaps I am simply tired of being told what must and must not happen, and curious to discover what could happen instead, if given the chance. Before she could respond, voices sounded from the direction of the house, Mrs. Ashworth's among them, calling for the Duke, wondering where he had wandered off to. He straightened at once, his expression smoothing back into the careful, formal mask he wore in the family's presence. I must go, he said quietly. Please, do not let anything I have said cause you difficulty. I will find another way to speak with you, if you will permit it. He did not wait for her answer before turning and walking quickly back toward the path, disappearing behind the hedge just as Mrs. Ashworth's voice grew closer, sharp with barely concealed worry about where her guest had gone. Hannah remained kneeling in the garden long after the voices faded, her hands still, her mind racing through everything the Duke had said, everything it might mean, everything it might cost her if anyone ever learned of it. She did not know whether to feel hope or dread, and in the end, she felt both at once, tangled together so tightly she could not separate one from the other. That evening, as she carried the day's harvest of vegetables into the kitchen, she caught sight of Mrs. Ashworth watching her from the hallway window above, a long, unreadable stare that lasted only a few seconds before the woman turned away. Hannah said nothing to anyone about what had happened in the garden that day, but she understood, with growing certainty, that the quiet, careful life she had built for herself at Ashworth Hall was beginning to slip away, replaced by something far more uncertain and far more dangerous than she had ever wanted for herself. Inside the house, the walk to the neighboring estate had gone poorly, though none of the family understood exactly why. The Duke had returned from his brief absence in the garden with an expression too composed to read, and he had spent the remainder of the visit answering questions politely, but without any real warmth, his mind clearly elsewhere. Margaret had tried, once again, to draw him into conversation about literature, and Charlotte had described in great detail a garden party she hoped to host later that summer, but the Duke's responses grew shorter and shorter as the afternoon wore on, until even Lord Ashworth noticed and remarked, quietly, to his wife that their guest seemed unusually distracted. Mrs. Ashworth had noticed it too, and she had spent the walk turning over every possible explanation in her mind, none of which brought her any comfort. She had seen the Duke arrive later than expected to join the group near the garden, claiming he had wished to view the grounds alone before the walk began. She had not seen where exactly he had wandered, but she had her suspicions, sharp and unwelcome, and by the time the visit ended and the Duke's carriage disappeared down the drive, those suspicions had hardened into something close to certainty. She waited until the daughters had retired for the evening before summoning the housekeeper, a stern, practical woman named Mrs. Pratt who had served the family for over 20 years, and who understood, better than anyone else in the household, exactly how much depended on the success of this match. I want to know everything the girl does, every hour of every day, Mrs. Ashworth said, pacing the length of her small sitting room. Where she goes, who she speaks with, whether she leaves the house grounds for any reason at all. I want a full account each evening. Mrs. Pratt, who had never particularly liked Hannah but had also never found real fault with her work, hesitated slightly before agreeing. May I ask what has prompted this, madam? You may not, Mrs. Ashworth said, though her tone made clear that she herself was not entirely certain how to explain what she feared, only that the fear itself was real and growing stronger by the day. Simply do as I ask. From that evening forward, Hannah found herself watched in ways both subtle and obvious. Mrs. Pratt appeared unexpectedly in rooms where Hannah worked, offering no explanation for her presence beyond vague comments about checking on the household's general order. Other maids, some sympathetic and some clearly reporting back to Mrs. Pratt for reasons of their own, seemed to appear whenever Hannah stepped outside for even a few minutes. Hannah bore the scrutiny as best she could, continuing her work without complaint, though the constant sense of being observed wore at her more than any amount of physical labor could have. She began to feel like a prisoner within the walls of the only home she had known for the past 5 years, watched and judged for a crime she had not chosen to commit, punished simply for having been noticed by a man whose attention she had never sought. Word of the Duke's distracted behavior during the estate walk had reached the servants' quarters as well, carried by one of the footmen who had overheard Lord Ashworth discussing it with his wife. The gossip spread quickly among the staff, most of it harmless speculation about whether the match with one of the daughters might be falling through, though a few of the sharper-eyed maids exchanged knowing glances whenever Hannah's name happened to come up in the same conversation. One evening, nearly a week after the garden encounter, Hannah was summoned to Mrs. Ashworth's sitting room directly, an event so unusual that her hands shook slightly as she smoothed her apron and knocked on the door. Mrs. Ashworth sat by the window, her expression carefully composed, though something taut and cold ran beneath the surface of her calm. "Sit down, Hannah," she said, gesturing to a small chair near the door, though her tone made the invitation feel more like a command awaiting compliance than an act of courtesy. Hannah sat, keeping her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. "I will not waste time pretending I do not know what has been happening," Mrs. Ashworth said. "The Duke has shown you attention that is entirely inappropriate to your position, and I believe you have done little to discourage it." "Madam, I have done nothing to encourage it either," Hannah said carefully. "I have only performed my duties as instructed." "Perhaps." Mrs. Ashworth's eyes narrowed slightly. "But intentions matter little when the outcome threatens everything my family has worked toward. Do you understand what is at stake here, Hannah? Do you understand what will happen to this family, to your fellow servants, to the very roof over your head, if this house loses the chance at an alliance that could save us from ruin?" Hannah did understand, more clearly perhaps than Mrs. Ashworth realized, having grown up witnessing firsthand what happened to families and servants alike when fortunes collapsed entirely. She had seen it happen to her own family before her mother's death, the slow unraveling of security, the desperate scramble that followed. She understood the stakes perfectly well. "I understand, madam," she said quietly, "and I have no wish to cause harm to this family or to jeopardize my position here, but I cannot control the Duke's actions or his words. I can only control my own, and I have behaved with nothing but proper respect toward him and toward this household." Mrs. Ashworth studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, not quite softening, but growing more calculating, more deliberate. "Then you will help me ensure this matter resolves itself properly," she said. "You will avoid the Duke entirely during any future visits. You will not speak to him, will not serve him, will not so much as cross his path if it can be helped. Can I trust you to manage this much at least?" "Yes, madam," Hannah said, though something inside her ached at the promise, a feeling she did not fully understand and did not have time to examine, not with Mrs. Ashworth's sharp eyes fixed on her, waiting for any sign of hesitation or defiance. "Good." Mrs. Ashworth rose, signaling the conversation's end. "See that you keep your word, Hannah, for your own sake, as much as this family's." Hannah left the sitting room with the strange, hollow feeling of having agreed to something that felt both entirely reasonable and deeply wrong at the same time. She told herself, as she made her way back down to the kitchen, that avoiding the Duke was the sensible course, the only course that made sense given everything she stood to lose. She told herself this firmly, repeatedly, and yet found the words offered little comfort against the memory of his voice in the garden, quiet and earnest, telling her that his attention was not idle curiosity at all. She did not know, as she climbed the narrow stairs to her small room that night, that keeping her promise to Mrs. Ashworth would prove far more difficult than she imagined, or that the Duke himself had no intention of simply letting the matter rest, regardless of what promises had been extracted from a maid who had never asked for any of this to happen in the first place. The knock on the servant's door came just after dawn, sharp and urgent, and Hannah opened it to find a young stable boy standing there, out of breath, holding a small folded note that he pressed into her hands before she could ask what was happening. "From a gentleman," the boy whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Said I was to give it to you directly, and to no one else." Hannah's stomach turned to ice. She thanked the boy quickly and sent him off before anyone else could notice the exchange, then slipped back into the small pantry off the kitchen, the only place she could think of that offered a moment of privacy, and unfolded the note with trembling fingers. The handwriting was elegant, controlled, unmistakably belonging to someone with far more education than she possessed. It asked only that she meet him briefly near the old stone bridge at the edge of the estate's northern boundary, at an hour when the household would still be occupied with breakfast preparations, if she was willing. She read the note 3 times before folding it carefully and tucking it into the pocket of her apron, her mind racing through every reason she should refuse, every promise she had made to Mrs. Ashworth only days before. She had given her word. She had agreed to avoid him entirely, for her own sake as much as the family's, and breaking that promise now would put everything at risk. And yet she found herself, less than an hour later, walking quickly along the path toward the northern boundary, telling herself with every step that she intended only to explain, clearly and firmly, that these meetings could not continue, that whatever he felt or believed he felt, it changed nothing about the reality of their positions in the world. The Duke was waiting when she arrived, standing near the old bridge with his hands clasped behind his back, dressed simply, without any of the formal trappings that usually marked his visits to the house. He looked, for a moment, less like a duke and more like an ordinary man waiting nervously for someone he cared about, and the sight of him standing there, uncertain and hopeful, made something in Hannah's resolve waver before she had even spoken a word. "You came," he said, and there was real relief in his voice. "I should not have," Hannah said, though she made no move to leave. "Your Grace, I gave my word to Mrs. Ashworth that I would avoid you entirely. If she learns of this meeting, I will lose my position, and likely without any reference to help me find another." "I know," he said, and to her surprise, he looked genuinely troubled by this. "I have thought of little else since our conversation in the garden, and I confess I have handled this poorly. I did not intend to put you in such a difficult position." "Then why send for me at all?" The question came out sharper than she intended, months of careful restraint finally cracking under the weight of everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks. He was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression that seemed to weigh several possible answers before settling on one. "Because I find I cannot simply forget you, no matter how much sense it would make to try," he said finally. "I have spent my life being told exactly who I should marry, what family would benefit my position, what alliance would serve my estate best. I have never once been asked what I actually want." "And what you want," Hannah said carefully, "is a maid with no fortune and no family name worth mentioning." "What I want," he said, "is honesty. I want a wife who speaks to me as a person rather than a title, who does not calculate every word for its effect on my opinion of her. In 2 visits to your household, you are the only person who has managed that, and you did it entirely by accident, simply by being yourself." Hannah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes and blinked them back firmly, unwilling to let emotion overtake the careful composure she had maintained through every difficult moment of her life so far. "Your Grace, wanting honesty does not change the world we live in. A duke cannot marry a maid. Society would never accept it, and your family, your name, everything you owe to your position, would suffer for it." "Perhaps," he said again, the same word he had used in the garden, and she was beginning to understand that it meant he had already considered every objection she could offer, and found none of them sufficient to change his mind. "But I have begun to wonder whether protecting a name matters more than living an honest life. My father built our family's reputation on exactly the kind of calculated marriages you describe, and I watched that marriage make both my parents miserable for 30 years. I do not wish to repeat his mistakes simply because it would be easier." Before Hannah could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps on the path behind them made both of them turn sharply. Charlotte stood at the bend in the path, her expression frozen in obvious shock, having clearly followed Hannah from the house without either of them noticing. "I knew it," Charlotte said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and something that looked almost like triumph. "I knew there was something happening between you. Mother will hear of this within the hour." "Charlotte, please," Hannah began, stepping forward. But Charlotte had already turned and was hurrying back toward the house, her skirts gathered in one hand, moving as quickly as the uneven path would allow. The Duke moved as though to follow, but Hannah caught his arm without thinking, her fingers closing around his sleeve before she remembered herself, and pulled back sharply. "Let her go," she said. "Following her will only make everything worse. Please, Your Grace, you must return to your lodgings and allow me to handle whatever comes of this." "I will not let you face this alone," he said firmly. "Whatever consequences follow from this discovery, I intend to take responsibility for my part in it." "Your part in it will cost you nothing," Hannah said, bitterness creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm. "You are a duke. Society will forgive a moment of eccentric interest in a servant girl and forget it within the season. I am the one who will be dismissed without reference, the one who will have nowhere to go and no way to explain what happened without sounding exactly like the kind of scheming maid every family fears having in their household." The truth of her words seemed to land heavily on him, and for a moment he said nothing, his expression caught between frustration and genuine distress. "Then I will make certain that does not happen," he said finally. "I give you my word, Hannah. Whatever comes of this, I will not allow you to suffer for it." Hannah wanted to believe him. Standing there beside the old stone bridge, with the morning light filtering through the trees and his voice steady with conviction, she wanted very badly to believe that his word carried the weight he clearly believed it did. But 5 years of service in a household governed entirely by the whims and calculations of people with more power than she possessed had taught her not to place too much faith in promises, however sincerely they were offered. "I must go," she said instead, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, as though it might offer some protection against what waited for her back at the house. "Whatever happens now, I would rather face it directly than delay and make things worse." She turned and walked quickly back toward the house without waiting for his response, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else she did not have time to examine. Some small, stubborn flicker of hope that refused to be entirely extinguished, despite everything she knew about the impossible distance between a duke and a maid. By the time she reached the house, the news had already spread. She could tell from the moment she stepped through the servants' entrance, from the sudden silence that fell over the kitchen when she entered, from the way cook would not quite meet her eyes, from the tension that seemed to have settled over every corner of the household like a physical weight. Mrs. Ashworth summoned her within minutes, and this time there was no pretense of a calm conversation. The older woman's face was flushed with anger, her hands clenched at her sides, every trace of the careful control she usually maintained stripped away entirely. "You gave me your word," Mrs. Ashworth said, her voice low and furious. "You stood in my sitting room and promised me you would avoid him, and within a week you were meeting him in secret, away from the house, where no one would see." "Madam, I did not seek that meeting," Hannah said, though she knew even as she spoke that the explanation would carry little weight. "He sent for me. I went only to tell him plainly that these meetings could not continue." "And yet Charlotte found you standing close together, speaking in low voices, in a spot chosen specifically because it was hidden from the house." Mrs. Ashworth's voice rose with each word. "Do you take me for a fool, Hannah? Do you believe I cannot see exactly what you are attempting to do?" "I am attempting nothing, madam." Hannah kept her voice steady despite the fear tightening in her chest. "I have no ambitions toward the Duke. I understand perfectly well what is and is not possible for someone in my position." "Then you will have no difficulty proving that understanding," Mrs. Ashworth said coldly. "You will remain confined to the kitchen and the servants' quarters until this matter resolves itself, one way or another. You will not step outside these walls without express permission, and you will have no further contact with the Duke under any circumstances. If you disobey this instruction even once more, you will be dismissed immediately, without reference, and I will make certain every household in this county knows exactly why." Hannah bowed her head, the weight of the threat settling over her like a physical thing. "Yes, madam," she said quietly, though inside she felt something hardening, some new resolve forming beneath the fear, a determination that whatever happened next, she would not simply disappear quietly, would not let herself be erased entirely from a situation she had never asked to be part of but now found herself unable to fully step away from either. That evening, as she lay awake in her small room, listening to the muffled sounds of the household settling into an uneasy silence around her, Hannah found herself thinking, against every instinct toward caution, of the Duke's promise beside the old stone bridge, and wondering, despite everything, whether a man of his position truly had the power to keep it. Across the house, in the parlor where the family gathered after supper, the mood remained tense long into the evening. Lord Ashworth paced near the fireplace, his earlier comfortable blindness about the situation now replaced by genuine alarm, as he finally understood the full scope of what his wife had been managing quietly for weeks. "This cannot continue," he said, running a hand through his thinning hair. "If word of this spreads beyond our household, we will be ruined twice over, once by our debts and again by scandal. No respectable family will consider a match with any of our daughters if it becomes known that a duke was distracted from them by a servant girl." "I am aware of the danger, Reginald," Mrs. Ashworth said sharply, though her own composure had grown thin by this point in the evening. "I have been managing it as best I can. The girl has been confined to the house. She will have no further opportunity to see him. And if he seeks her out again, as he apparently already has once," Margaret's voice carried an edge of frustration that had been building since Charlotte first burst into the house with her breathless report. "You cannot confine a duke, mother. If he wishes to speak with a maid, he will find a way to do it, regardless of what restrictions we place on her." The truth of this observation settled uncomfortably over the room, and no one offered an immediate response. Charlotte, who had positioned herself near the window with an expression that mixed satisfaction at having been the one to discover the secret meeting, with genuine anxiety about what it might mean for the family's prospects, finally spoke. "Perhaps the solution is simpler than we are making it," she said. "Dismiss her entirely. Send her away before the Duke can seek her out again. Without the girl present in the household at all, his attention will have nowhere to settle except where it belongs." Mrs. Ashworth considered this for a long moment, and Hannah, had she been present to hear it, would have felt the full weight of how close this suggestion came to deciding her fate that very evening. But something held Mrs. Ashworth back from agreeing immediately, some calculation that ran deeper than her daughter's simpler reasoning. "If we dismiss her now, without cause that can be clearly explained, it may only draw more attention to the situation rather than less," Mrs. Ashworth said slowly. "The Duke has shown himself willing to seek her out, even against instruction. If she disappears suddenly from the household, he may make inquiries, may even discover where she has gone, and that would create precisely the scandal we are trying to avoid. No, we must handle this more carefully. Confine her for now. Watch her closely. If the Duke's interest fades on its own, as such things generally do, we lose nothing by waiting. And if it does not fade?" Clara asked quietly, speaking for nearly the first time since the discovery that afternoon, her voice small but steady in a way that surprised her sisters. Mrs. Ashworth's expression darkened. "Then we will take whatever steps prove necessary, regardless of what they might be." The conversation drifted into uneasy silence after that, each member of the family retreating into their own private worries about what the coming days might bring. Lord Ashworth resumed his pacing, calculating debts and creditors in his mind, wondering how many more months the family's finances could survive without a successful match to secure their future. Margaret sat rigid in her chair, humiliated by the realization that her carefully rehearsed conversations about poetry and literature had meant nothing beside a few honest words exchanged with a maid over spilled tea. Charlotte watched the fire with an expression of grim satisfaction, already turning over new ideas in her mind for how the situation might yet be resolved in the family's favor, ideas she had not yet shared with anyone, not even her mother. And Clara, quieter than any of them, found herself thinking not of the family's ruined prospects or the scandal that might yet unfold, but of the brief glimpse she had caught of Hannah's face in the hallway earlier that evening, pale and frightened but unmistakably resolute, and wondering, with a discomfort she did not fully understand, whether her family's plans were truly as reasonable and necessary as her mother insisted they were. The summons came without warning, delivered by Mrs. Pratt with an expression that gave nothing away, only the words that Hannah was to present herself in the main drawing room immediately, dressed as she was, with no time to change or prepare. Hannah's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her apron and followed Mrs. Pratt through the servants' corridor and into the main part of the house, a section she had rarely entered since her confinement began nearly 2 weeks earlier. The closer they came to the drawing room, the more clearly she could hear voices, several of them, raised in a tone that suggested some kind of gathering, rather than a simple family conversation. When Mrs. Pratt opened the door and gestured for her to enter, Hannah understood immediately why the summons had felt so urgent, so different from anything that had come before. The room was full. Mrs. Ashworth stood near the fireplace, her expression rigid with barely controlled tension. Lord Ashworth sat in his usual chair, looking older and more worn than Hannah had ever seen him. Margaret and Charlotte stood together near the window, and Clara sat alone on a small settee, her hands folded tightly in her lap, but it was the presence of 2 other people that made Hannah's chest tighten with sudden dread. Lady Cavenden, the Duke's aunt, a formidable woman known throughout the county for her sharp tongue and sharper judgment, sat in the best chair in the room, her posture perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on Hannah with an expression of cold appraisal. Beside her stood a younger woman Hannah did not recognize, elegantly dressed, watching the scene unfold with an air of detached curiosity that somehow felt worse than open hostility. The Duke himself was nowhere to be seen. "So this is the girl," Lady Cavenden said, her voice cutting through the silence with the precision of a blade. "I confess I expected someone more remarkable, given the trouble she has caused." Hannah stood near the door, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent, painfully aware of every eye in the room fixed upon her. "My nephew has made something of a spectacle of himself," Lady Cavenden continued, addressing the room generally, though her eyes remained on Hannah. "Word has reached London that he has developed an inappropriate attachment to a servant girl in this county. I have come to see the truth of the matter for myself and to put an end to it before it destroys everything our family has worked to build." Mrs. Ashworth's face had gone pale at the mention of London, of word having already spread beyond the boundaries of their own small world. "Lady Cavenden, I assure you, this household has done everything possible to discourage any such attachment. The girl has been confined, restricted, kept entirely apart from your nephew since we first became aware of the situation. And yet the situation persists," Lady Cavenden said dryly, "which suggests your efforts have been rather less effective than you claim." The younger woman beside her spoke for the first time, her voice light but carrying an edge of amusement that felt cruel in its precision. "Perhaps we should simply ask the girl herself what she hopes to gain from all of this. Surely she understands that nothing can come of a duke's passing fancy for someone in her position." Hannah felt heat rise in her face, humiliation mixing with a fierce, unfamiliar anger that surprised her with its intensity. She had spent 5 years training herself to remain calm, to accept whatever role was assigned to her without complaint. But something about being discussed as though she were not present, as though her feelings and thoughts mattered less than furniture in the room, broke through that careful training entirely. "I have not sought anything from your nephew, my lady," Hannah said, her voice steadier than she expected given the pounding of her heart. "I have done nothing but perform my duties as they were given to me. Whatever attention he has shown me was not invited, and I have made every effort, at real cost to myself, to discourage it." "How noble," the younger woman said, her tone making clear she believed no such thing. "And yet here we all are, gathered to discuss you specifically, rather than any of the young ladies actually presented to him for consideration." Charlotte, standing near the window, could not quite hide the flash of satisfaction that crossed her face at this observation, though she quickly composed herself when Lady Cavenden's sharp gaze swept briefly in her direction. "Enough," Lady Cavenden said, raising a hand. "Whatever this girl's intentions, real or imagined, the practical reality remains unchanged. My nephew cannot marry a servant. Such a match would destroy his standing, damage the family name built over generations, and provide fodder for gossip that would follow him for the rest of his life. I will not permit it, and I suspect, once he reflects seriously on the matter, he will understand this himself." She turned her attention fully to Hannah now, her expression softening slightly, though nothing about her tone grew warmer. "I do not blame you entirely for this situation, girl. Young men in my nephew's position often develop foolish attachments when they feel trapped by the expectations placed upon them. But you must understand that whatever he has said to you, whatever promises he may have made in a moment of impulse, none of it can be honored. The kindest thing you can do, for yourself as much as for him, is to remove yourself from the situation entirely." "What do you mean, remove myself?" Hannah asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "I mean precisely what you think I mean." Lady Cavenden's voice remained calm, businesslike. "I am prepared to offer you a position in a household far from this county, along with a generous sum to help you establish yourself there. In exchange, you will leave this house today, without informing my nephew of your destination, and you will have no further contact with him of any kind." The room fell utterly silent. Hannah felt the weight of the offer settle over her like a physical thing, understanding immediately what it represented. A chance to escape the increasingly dangerous situation she found herself trapped within. A chance for a fresh start somewhere far from Mrs. Ashworth's cold suspicion and Charlotte's open hostility. A chance to simply disappear before matters grew any worse than they already had. It would be so easy to accept. She could take the money, travel somewhere new, build a quiet life for herself far from all of this, and eventually the Duke's attention, whatever it truly meant, would fade into memory, as Mrs. Ashworth had predicted from the very beginning. And yet something in her resisted the offer, some stubborn thread of feeling she had tried desperately to suppress since that first afternoon serving tea, when he had thanked her as though she were a person worth acknowledging rather than simply a servant fulfilling her expected role. "May I have time to consider your offer, my lady?" Hannah asked, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain what answer she hoped to give. "There is nothing to consider," Lady Cavenden said, a note of impatience entering her voice for the first time. "This is a generous offer, far more than a girl in your position has any right to expect. I suggest you accept it gracefully and be grateful for the opportunity." Mrs. Ashworth stepped forward quickly, her expression a careful mixture of relief and eagerness to see the matter resolved. "Hannah, surely you understand the wisdom of accepting Lady Cavenden's generosity. This solves everything, for you as much as for this family." Hannah looked around the room, at Mrs. Ashworth's barely concealed desperation, at Charlotte's poorly hidden satisfaction, at Margaret's cool indifference, and finally at Clara, who alone among the sisters would not quite meet her eyes, her expression troubled in a way that suggested she, at least, felt some discomfort with what was unfolding. "I understand the offer, my lady," Hannah said slowly, "but I would ask that I be permitted to hear this from the Duke himself, before I make any final decision. If he wishes me to leave, if he believes this solution serves his interests best, then I will accept your offer without further argument. But I will not simply disappear based on the assurances of others about what he wants, when he has not spoken those wishes to me directly. The demand hung in the air, bold enough that even Lady Cavenden seemed momentarily taken aback by it, though she recovered quickly, her expression hardening. "You are in no position to make demands," she said sharply. "You are a servant, and this arrangement is far more generous than your circumstances warrant. I am aware of my position, my lady," Hannah said, holding her ground despite the fear churning in her stomach. "But I have done nothing wrong, and I will not be sent away like a problem to be quietly removed. without at least the courtesy of hearing directly from the person whose feelings supposedly caused all of this trouble in the first place. For a long moment, no one spoke. Lady Cavenden studied Hannah with an expression that had shifted from cold appraisal to something closer to grudging surprise, as though she had not expected a servant girl to possess the kind of quiet resolve now standing before her. "Very well," she said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled irritation. "I will send word to my nephew that this matter requires his presence, but understand, girl, that whatever he says when he arrives, the outcome will remain unchanged. He will not marry you. I will see to that personally, regardless of what promises he may have made in a moment of misguided passion." She rose from her chair, gesturing for the younger woman beside her to follow, and swept from the room without another word, leaving behind a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on everyone remaining within it. Mrs. Ashworth turned to Hannah, her earlier relief replaced now with something closer to fury. "What have you done?" she demanded. "You had a chance to end this quietly, to walk away with money and a fresh start, and you have thrown it away out of pride." "It is not pride, madam," Hannah said quietly, though exhaustion had begun to settle over her now that the immediate confrontation had ended. "It is simply that I have spent my entire life being told what to do by people who never once asked what I actually wanted. I am not willing to disappear based on someone else's assumption about what is best for me, not this time." She left the drawing room without waiting for permission, walking back through the servants' corridor with her head held high despite the trembling in her legs, unaware that behind her, in the room she had just left, Clara had finally spoken up for the first time in weeks, quietly telling her mother that perhaps, just perhaps, the girl deserved more consideration than any of them had been willing to give her. That night, alone in her small room, Hannah allowed herself to cry for the first time since the whole situation had begun, not from despair exactly, but from the sheer exhaustion of holding herself together through weeks of suspicion, confinement, and now open confrontation with a woman powerful enough to reshape the entire course of her life, with nothing more than a generous offer and a few cold words. She did not know what the Duke would say when he arrived. She did not know whether his feelings, whatever they truly were, could withstand the weight of his aunt's disapproval and the practical realities of his position. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she would rather face whatever came next honestly than disappear quietly into a life built on someone else's decision about what she deserved. The following morning brought attention to the household unlike anything Hannah had experienced since arriving at Ashworth Hall as a child. Word of the confrontation in the drawing room had spread quickly among the staff, whispered between maids as they worked, discussed in hushed tones in the kitchen when cook believed no one important was listening. Some of the servants regarded Hannah with open curiosity now, others with wary distance, as though her strange entanglement with the Duke had transformed her into someone unpredictable, someone who no longer quite belonged among them. Mrs. Ashworth kept her confined to the kitchen entirely that day, refusing to allow her anywhere near the family's private rooms, though the restriction felt less like punishment now, and more like genuine uncertainty about what to do with a servant who had somehow become the center of a crisis involving a Duke and his formidable aunt. By mid-afternoon, word arrived that the Duke had received his aunt's message and would call at Ashworth Hall the following day to address the matter directly. The news sent a fresh wave of anxiety through the household, though for very different reasons among its various members. Mrs. Ashworth spent the remainder of the day drafting and redrafting a letter to Lady Cavenden, attempting to reassure her that the family bore no responsibility for the situation and remained eager to see one of their own daughters properly considered as a match. Lord Ashworth retreated to his study with a bottle of brandy, muttering about ruin and scandal in equal measure. Margaret and Charlotte argued quietly in their shared sitting room about whether the whole affair had permanently destroyed any chance either of them had at securing the Duke's interest, regardless of how the matter with Hannah resolved itself. Clara, meanwhile, found herself drawn toward the kitchen that evening, an unusual occurrence given how rarely any of the sisters ventured into that part of the house. She found Hannah alone, scrubbing pots long after the other servants had retired for the night, her movements slow with exhaustion but steady, as though the familiar work offered some small comfort amid everything else that had happened. "May I speak with you?" Clara asked from the doorway, her voice hesitant. Hannah looked up, surprised, and set down the pot she had been cleaning. "Of course, miss." Clara stepped further into the kitchen, glancing around as though uncertain how to behave in a space so unfamiliar to her. "I wanted to say that I am sorry," she said finally, "for how my family has treated you through all of this. I do not believe you asked for any part of it, and it has not seemed fair, watching everyone assume the worst of you without ever truly asking what you wanted." Hannah studied the youngest Ashworth sister carefully, uncertain how to respond to a kindness so unexpected after weeks of suspicion and hostility from nearly everyone else in the household. "Thank you, miss," she said finally. "That means more than you might realize." "I do not know what will happen tomorrow," Clara continued, twisting her hands together nervously. "I do not know whether the Duke truly cares for you as much as everyone seems to fear, or whether his aunt is right that nothing can come of it regardless. But I wanted you to know that not everyone in this house believes you deserve to be sent away, simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time." The kindness in Clara's words struck Hannah more deeply than she expected, and she found herself blinking back sudden tears, exhausted as she was from weeks of tension and confrontation. "You are kinder than your sisters give you credit for being, miss," she said softly. Clara offered a small, sad smile. "Margaret and Charlotte have spent their whole lives being taught that position and fortune matter more than anything else. I am not certain I believe that anymore, watching all of this unfold. Whatever happens tomorrow, I hope it brings you some measure of peace, one way or another." She left the kitchen as quietly as she had entered it, leaving Hannah alone once more with her thoughts, though the brief exchange had shifted something inside her, a small reminder that not everyone in the world viewed her situation with the same cold calculation that had governed most of her interactions with the Ashworth family since the whole affair began. Sleep did not come easily that night. Hannah lay awake for hours, turning over every possible outcome of the following day's meeting, trying to prepare herself for whatever the Duke might say, whatever decision he might reach when faced directly with his aunt's disapproval, and the full weight of the practical obstacles standing between them. She told herself firmly that she should hope for nothing, expect nothing, that the wisest course remained accepting whatever resolution emerged, and moving forward with whatever life circumstances allowed her. And yet, despite every effort to guard her heart against disappointment, she found herself remembering his voice beside the old stone bridge, steady and certain, promising that he would not let her suffer for whatever attention he had shown her, and she could not entirely extinguish the small, stubborn hope that his promise might yet prove strong enough to withstand whatever pressures tomorrow would bring. The household rose early the next morning, an unusual stillness settling over the halls as everyone prepared, in their own way, for the confrontation that awaited them. Hannah dressed carefully in her plainest, most practical clothing, understanding instinctively that whatever happened today, she wanted to face it as herself, without pretense or performance, exactly as she had approached every difficult moment since this strange chapter of her life had begun. The carriage arrived precisely at 11 o'clock, and this time it was not one carriage but two, the second bearing Lady Cavenden and her companion, arriving separately but clearly by arrangement, ready to witness whatever conclusion the morning would bring. Hannah stood in the kitchen, unable to eat the breakfast cook had pressed upon her, listening to the sounds of arrival drifting through the house, the crunch of wheels on gravel, the murmur of greetings exchanged in the entrance hall, footsteps moving toward the drawing room where the entire household had gathered to await the Duke's arrival. She had not been summoned yet, and the waiting proved almost worse than the confrontation itself, her mind circling endlessly through every possible outcome, every word the Duke might say, every way this day might end in either quiet devastation or something she barely dared to hope for. When Mrs. Pratt finally appeared at the kitchen door to fetch her, Hannah rose on legs that felt unsteady beneath her, smoothing her apron one final time, before following the housekeeper through the familiar corridor toward the drawing room, the same path she had walked the previous day, though everything about this journey felt different, heavier, as though the outcome of the entire situation hung suspended in the air around her. The room was even fuller than before. Lady Cavenden sat once more in the best chair, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Ashworth and Lord Ashworth stood near the fireplace, tension radiating from both of them. Margaret and Charlotte had positioned themselves near the window again, and Clara sat quietly on the settee, catching Hannah's eye briefly with an expression of quiet encouragement that offered small comfort amid the overwhelming weight of the room. The Duke stood near the center of the room, and when Hannah entered, his eyes found hers immediately, holding her gaze with an intensity that made everything else in the room seem to fade slightly into the background. "Hannah," he said, and the simple use of her name, without any title or formality, seemed to carry more weight than any elaborate speech could have managed. "Your Grace." She dropped into a small curtsy out of habit, though he crossed the room quickly to stand before her, close enough that the formal distance the gesture usually implied felt suddenly meaningless. "I understand my aunt made you an offer yesterday," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough for the entire room to hear. "An offer to send you away, to remove you from this situation entirely, under the assumption that this reflects my true wishes." "Julian," Lady Cavenden interjected sharply, "we discussed this already. You know what must be done." The Duke did not look away from Hannah, though his voice remained steady as he addressed his aunt. "We discussed what you believe must be done, Aunt. I have not yet given you my answer." The room fell into absolute silence. Lady Cavenden's expression tightened with visible displeasure, but she said nothing further, allowing her nephew to continue. "I have spent the entire journey here, considering everything you said yesterday," he continued, still speaking to Hannah, though his words clearly addressed everyone present. "I considered the damage to my family's reputation, the scandal that would follow, the difficulty my future children might face if I chose a path so far outside what society expects of a man in my position. I considered all of it very seriously, because I understand the weight of these concerns is not imaginary." Hannah's heart sank slightly, bracing herself for what seemed like the inevitable conclusion, that he had weighed everything and found the risk too great, that he had come here to deliver, however gently, the same message his aunt had offered the day before. "But I also considered something else," he said, and something in his voice shifted, grew warmer, more certain. "I considered what kind of life I would build for myself if I chose the safe path, the expected marriage, the alliance that would please my family and satisfy society's expectations. I imagined years, decades perhaps, spent beside a wife chosen for her connections rather than her character, having conversations that never rose above careful performance, never once experiencing the kind of honest exchange I found, entirely by accident, with a maid who dropped a cake at my feet and apologized as though the world had ended." A small, surprised laugh escaped Hannah before she could stop it, and something in the Duke's expression softened at the sound, as though her laughter had confirmed something he had been hoping for. "I do not wish for that life," he continued, turning now to address the room more fully. "I have spent my entire life fulfilling obligations, meeting expectations, being exactly the Duke my family and my position required. I am asking, for the first time, to be allowed to choose something for myself, something built on genuine feeling, rather than calculated advantage." "Julian, this is madness," Lady Cavenden said, rising from her chair, her composure finally cracking under the weight of what she was hearing. "You cannot simply discard generations of family tradition because a servant girl has captured your fancy. Think of what this will mean, the whispers that will follow you, the doors that may close to you in society." "I have thought of it, Aunt, more carefully than you realize." The Duke's voice remained calm but firm, carrying an authority that seemed to still even Lady Cavenden's protest for a moment. "And I have concluded that I would rather face whispers and closed doors with a wife I genuinely respect and admire than spend my life comfortable in society's approval, while feeling nothing but quiet emptiness at home. My father built exactly the marriage you describe as ideal, and I watched it hollow out both my parents, until neither of them recognized the people they had become. I will not repeat that mistake simply because it is expected of me." Mrs. Ashworth, who had remained silent through this exchange, finally found her voice, though it emerged strained and uncertain. "Your Grace, surely there are practical matters to consider. The girl has no fortune, no family connections, no education befitting a woman of your position. How would she even begin to manage the responsibilities that would fall to a duchess? She has managed the responsibilities of this household with more grace and competence than I have witnessed in far grander settings," the Duke replied. "She has faced weeks of suspicion, confinement, and open hostility, with a composure that many women raised specifically for positions of authority would struggle to match. I have no doubt she can learn whatever specific knowledge the role requires. What cannot be taught, what she already possesses in abundance, is character, honesty, and genuine strength of spirit." Hannah felt tears gathering in her eyes now, overwhelmed by hearing herself described in such terms, by a man whose opinion she had told herself repeatedly did not matter, could not matter, given the impossible gulf between their positions. "Your Grace," she said quietly, finding her voice at last amid the swirl of emotion the moment had stirred in her, "are you certain, truly certain? Because I will not have you make this choice only to regret it in a year's time, when the reality of what you have sacrificed becomes clearer than it may seem today." He turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his, without any hesitation, an act so bold in front of the assembled family and his own aunt, that a small gasp went around the room. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," he said. "I do not offer this out of impulse or rebellion against my aunt's expectations, though I confess some part of me does relish proving her wrong. I offer it because in the short time I have known you, you have shown me more genuine honesty than I have found in an entire lifetime among people trained to say exactly what others wish to hear. I would rather build my life with that honesty than without it, regardless of what it costs me in society's approval." Lady Cavenden watched this exchange with an expression that had shifted from anger toward something more complicated, a grudging recognition perhaps of conviction she had not expected to encounter in her nephew, conviction strong enough to withstand even her considerable disapproval. "You understand this decision cannot be easily reversed," she said finally, her voice quieter now, though still carrying the weight of genuine concern beneath the formality. "Once announced, there will be no retreating from it without far greater scandal than simply proceeding with the match." "I understand completely," the Duke said, still holding Hannah's hands, "and I do not intend to retreat from it at all." Lady Cavenden studied the two of them for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before finally sighing, a sound that carried something close to reluctant acceptance. "Then I suppose I have little choice but to support my nephew's decision, foolish as I continue to believe it to be. I will not pretend this brings me pleasure, but I have never known Julian to speak with such conviction about anything in his life, and I confess that gives me pause." Mrs. Ashworth stood frozen near the fireplace, her expression a mixture of shock and dawning realization that everything she had worked to prevent had happened despite her best efforts, that the maid she had confined and threatened and attempted to send away with money now stood at the center of the room, about to become something far grander than any of her own daughters had managed to achieve. "Your Grace," Mrs. Ashworth said finally, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure, "I hope you understand that this household never intended any disrespect toward you or your feelings. We acted only out of concern for propriety, and for Hannah's own protection." The Duke's expression grew somewhat cooler as he turned to address her directly. "I understand that you acted according to what you believed necessary, Mrs. Ashworth, but I also understand, from Hannah herself and from what I have witnessed with my own eyes, that your household's treatment of her these past weeks has been far from purely protective in nature. Confinement, threats of dismissal without reference, attempts to send her away with money as though she were an inconvenience to be quietly removed rather than a person with her own thoughts and feelings. These are not the actions of a household acting only in her interest." Mrs. Ashworth's face flushed deeply, and she seemed unable to formulate any response that might adequately defend the past week's behavior in the face of such a direct accounting. "I do not say this to punish you," the Duke continued, his tone softening slightly. "I understand the pressures your family faces, and I bear no ill will toward your daughters, who behaved as any young women raised under such pressure might behave. But I would ask that going forward, this household extend to Hannah the respect and consideration due to any person, regardless of the position she was born into, or the position she is about to hold." Charlotte, standing near the window, looked as though she wished the floor might open and swallow her entirely. The earlier satisfaction she had felt at discovering the secret meeting now replaced by the sick realization of exactly how her actions appeared in this new light. Margaret's expression had settled into something between shock and grudging acceptance, the careful calculations she had built her entire courtship strategy around having proven entirely useless against something as simple and unplanned as genuine affection. Only Clara, sitting quietly on the settee, seemed to watch the unfolding scene with something other than dismay, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips as she watched Hannah, still holding the Duke's hands, blinking back tears of overwhelming relief and disbelief at how dramatically the morning had transformed from what she had feared into something she had barely allowed herself to hope for. "Hannah," the Duke said, turning back to her, his voice dropping into something more private despite the room full of witnesses, "I know this is sudden, and I know I have not asked you properly, in the manner such a question deserves, but I find I cannot wait any longer to ask it plainly. Will you marry me? Not because it would solve some practical problem, not because society expects it, but because I have come to care for you more deeply than I ever expected to care for anyone, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my life discovering exactly how deep that care might grow." Hannah looked around the room one final time, at Mrs. Ashworth's shocked disbelief, at Lady Cavenden's grudging acceptance, at Charlotte's mortification and Margaret's stunned silence, at Clara's small, encouraging smile, before finally letting her gaze settle fully on the man standing before her, waiting patiently for her answer despite the weight of everything riding on it. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "Yes, Your Grace, I will marry you." The room erupted into a confusion of reactions, Lady Cavenden's sigh of resignation mixing with Lord Ashworth's stunned murmur and Clara's small, delighted laugh. But Hannah heard none of it clearly, her entire attention fixed on the Duke's face as he smiled at her answer, a real, unguarded smile that transformed his features entirely, stripping away every trace of the careful, formal reserve he had carried through both of their earlier meetings. "Then it is settled," he said softly, for her ears alone despite the room full of witnesses around them. Whatever comes next, whatever difficulties we face, we will face them honestly, together, exactly as we found each other. In the days that followed, news of the engagement spread through the county with astonishing speed, carried first by servants exchanging gossip between households, then by the local newspaper, and finally by letters sent to London that ensured the story reached society's most fashionable drawing rooms within the week. Just as Lady Cavenden had predicted, whispers followed, some cruel, some merely curious, and more than a few doors that might once have opened easily to the future Duchess of Cavenden remained noticeably closed in the early days after the announcement. But Hannah found she cared far less about those closed doors than she had expected to. She had spent her entire life navigating the judgment of people who held power over her circumstances, and she discovered, to her own quiet surprise, that facing the disapproval of strangers who knew nothing of her character felt considerably easier than the years spent trying to remain invisible within a household that had never fully valued her. Mrs. Ashworth's attitude toward her shifted dramatically in the weeks following the engagement, transforming almost overnight from cold suspicion into something that resembled, at least on the surface, careful cultivation of goodwill. Hannah understood the change for exactly what it was, a calculated recognition that the woman who would soon become a duchess might yet prove useful to a family whose own fortunes remained precarious, but she found she could not summon much anger over the transformation. She had faced far worse from Mrs. Ashworth than simple opportunism, and she resolved to meet the woman's new courtesy with polite distance rather than open resentment, understanding that some relationships were better left cordial than genuinely repaired. Charlotte struggled the most visibly with the new arrangement, her earlier hostility curdling into an awkward, uncertain politeness whenever she and Hannah crossed paths in the weeks before the wedding. She never offered a direct apology for her role in reporting the secret meeting by the stone bridge, though Hannah noticed she had grown noticeably quieter, less inclined toward the sharp comments that had characterized her behavior throughout the earlier weeks of tension. Margaret, by contrast, seemed to reach a kind of practical acceptance more quickly than her sister, approaching Hannah directly one afternoon to offer what amounted to a genuine, if somewhat stiff, congratulations. "I confess I do not fully understand what my brother-to-be sees in the situation," she said, using the new family connection with obvious discomfort. "But I have watched him these past weeks, and I have never seen him speak with such conviction about anything. Whatever else I might think of the circumstances, I cannot deny that." It was Clara who offered the warmest response of all the sisters, seeking Hannah out regularly in the weeks leading up to the wedding, asking genuine questions about her life, her history, the small details of her years working in the household that none of the family had ever bothered to learn before. Their conversations grew into something that resembled the beginning of real friendship, an unexpected outcome that Hannah treasured more than almost anything else to emerge from the whole tumultuous affair. Julian, for his part, proved as steady in his commitment as his declaration in the drawing room had promised. He visited Ashworth Hall regularly in the weeks before the wedding, never again needing to send secret notes or arrange hidden meetings, instead calling openly and sitting with Hannah in the garden for long afternoons, teaching her gradually about the world she would soon enter, patiently answering her questions about London society, about the responsibilities that would fall to her as Duchess, about the history of his family and the estate she would one day help oversee. He also made good on his promise to protect her from any lasting consequence of the scandal that had briefly threatened to engulf them both. He spoke personally with several influential members of society whose opinions carried particular weight, and though he could not entirely prevent every whisper or every closed door, he ensured that the worst of the gossip faded far more quickly than Lady Cavenden had originally predicted, helped considerably by his aunt's own gradual grudging shift from disapproval toward something that eventually resembled genuine respect for Hannah's quiet strength and dignity throughout the entire ordeal. By the time the wedding date arrived, barely 2 months after that first afternoon when Hannah had nervously poured tea for a duke she never expected to notice her, the household that had once treated her with suspicion and confinement had settled, however imperfectly, into something approaching acceptance, and Hannah found herself standing at the threshold of a life so different from anything she had ever imagined for herself that it still felt, some mornings, like a dream she might wake from at any moment. The chapel at Cavenden stood full to its very doors on the morning of the wedding, filled with a curious mixture of guests, members of society who had come partly out of genuine goodwill and partly out of sheer curiosity to witness for themselves the maid who had somehow captured a duke's heart. Hannah stood at the entrance in a gown of pale ivory silk, her hands trembling slightly, though this time the trembling came from nerves of an entirely different kind than the fear that had once accompanied every tray of tea she carried into that same family's drawing room months before. Cook stood near the back of the chapel, having been given a place of honor at Hannah's own insistence, tears streaming freely down her weathered face as she watched the girl she had helped raise from a frightened 12-year-old into the woman now walking down the aisle toward the man waiting for her. Several of the other servants from Ashworth Hall had been invited as well, a gesture that had surprised Mrs. Ashworth but one that Hannah had insisted upon, understanding better than anyone the importance of remembering where she had come from, even as she stepped into a future none of them could have predicted. Julian waited at the altar, dressed formally, but with an expression far removed from the careful, guarded composure he had worn during those first visits to Ashworth Hall. He watched Hannah's approach with open, unguarded joy, and when she finally reached his side, he took her hands in his with the same certainty he had shown that day in the drawing room, when he had asked her to marry him in front of an entire room of skeptical witnesses. The ceremony itself passed in a blur for Hannah, the formal words and rituals of the church washing over her, while her attention remained fixed almost entirely on Julian's face, on the steady warmth in his eyes that had first drawn her attention during that very first afternoon, when he had thanked her for a cup of tea as though the gesture mattered more than anything else happening in the room. When the ceremony concluded and they turned to face the gathered guests as husband and wife, Hannah caught sight of Lady Cavenden in the front row, her expression composed but unmistakably softer than it had been during their first difficult meeting months earlier. The older woman offered a small, genuine nod, an acknowledgement that carried more weight than any elaborate speech might have managed, a quiet admission that whatever doubts she had harbored about the match had, over the intervening months, given way to something closer to real acceptance. Mrs. Ashworth and Lord Ashworth sat further back, their expressions carefully composed for the benefit of the watching crowd, though Hannah suspected the emotions beneath that composure remained considerably more complicated than simple joy for her happiness. She did not resent them for this. She understood now, with the clarity that distance and time had provided, that they had acted throughout the entire affair according to fears and pressures she had only partially understood at the time, pressures born of debts and desperation that had shaped every decision Mrs. Ashworth made regarding her daughter's futures and, by extension, regarding Hannah herself. Charlotte and Margaret sat beside their parents, both dressed elegantly for the occasion, both offering polite smiles when Hannah's gaze passed over them during the recessional. Their relationship with her remained, even now, somewhat distant and formal, built more on the practical necessity of maintaining civil family connections than on any genuine warmth. Hannah accepted this without bitterness, understanding that not every relationship damaged by weeks of suspicion and hostility could be fully repaired simply because circumstances had changed. Clara, however, sat near the front with an expression of unguarded delight, and when the ceremony concluded, she was among the first to embrace Hannah, whispering warm congratulations before stepping back to allow others their turn. Their friendship, born unexpectedly from the wreckage of the earlier crisis, had continued to grow steadily in the months since, and Hannah had come to treasure Clara's genuine kindness as one of the unexpected gifts to emerge from everything she had endured. The wedding celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, filled with music and dancing, and the kind of joyful commotion that Hannah had never imagined might one day surround her own life. She danced with Julian beneath the light of countless candles, both of them laughing at some private joke that no one else in the room could have understood. The easy warmth between them, entirely genuine, entirely unrehearsed, exactly the kind of honest connection that had first drawn Julian's attention to her all those months earlier. Later that evening, as the celebrations continued around them, Julian led Hannah out onto a quiet terrace overlooking the estate's extensive gardens, away from the noise and attention of the gathered guests. The night air felt cool and pleasant after the warmth of the crowded chapel and ballroom, and for a few precious minutes, they simply stood together in comfortable silence, watching moonlight settle over the carefully tended grounds that would now be Hannah's home. "Do you have any regrets?" Julian asked quietly, breaking the silence, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern beneath the question. Hannah considered the question seriously, understanding it deserved an honest answer, rather than a simple reassurance offered for its own sake. "None," she said finally. "There were moments, certainly, when I feared everything we hoped for might collapse entirely, when Mrs. Ashworth's suspicion or your aunt's disapproval seemed insurmountable. But I do not regret any of it, not the fear, not the difficulty, not even the weeks of confinement and confrontation. All of it led me here, to this moment, standing beside you as your wife rather than serving you tea as a stranger's maid." Julian smiled and drew her closer, resting his forehead gently against hers. "I confess I worried, more than once, that I had asked too much of you, that the cost of choosing this path might prove heavier than either of us anticipated when we first began this strange journey together. The cost has been real, Hannah acknowledged. I will not pretend otherwise. There are still whispers, still doors that remain closed to us, still people who will never fully accept a match built on something as simple as genuine affection, rather than calculated advantage. But I have found, in the months since your proposal, that I would rather live with those difficulties honestly than have spent my life quietly serving tea in someone else's drawing room, wondering always what might have happened had I found the courage to hope for something more. They remained on the terrace a while longer, talking quietly of the future that stretched before them, of the responsibilities Hannah would gradually learn to manage as Duchess, of the family they might one day build together, of the small, ordinary joys they both looked forward to sharing in the years ahead, joys that had nothing to do with titles or fortune, and everything to do with the simple, honest connection that had first drawn them together over a spilled cup of tea and an unexpected question about her name. In the months that followed the wedding, Hannah settled gradually into her new role, learning the countless responsibilities expected of a duchess with the same steady determination she had once brought to scrubbing cellar stairs and carrying heavy laundry baskets across the grounds of Ashworth Hall. She proved, as Julian had predicted in that crowded drawing room months earlier, remarkably capable. Her years of practical experience managing household affairs translating naturally into the broader responsibilities now placed upon her. She never forgot where she had come from, never allowed her new position to distance her entirely from the servants who now worked within her own household, treating each of them with the same respect and consideration she had once wished someone might show her during her own years in service. Word of this quality spread quietly among the staff at Cavendon, and within her new household at least, Hannah earned a genuine warmth and loyalty that no amount of fortune or title could have purchased on its own. Occasionally, on quiet afternoons when her official duties allowed a moment's rest, Hannah found herself thinking back to that first nervous walk into the Ashworth drawing room, tray trembling slightly in her hands, certain that nothing about that ordinary afternoon might change the careful, modest life she had built for herself through years of steady work and quiet endurance. She thought, too, of the countless moments afterward when everything had seemed poised to collapse entirely, when the weight of society's expectations and her own family's fear had threatened to crush whatever fragile connection had begun growing between herself and the Duke who had once, against every reasonable expectation, chosen to notice her. She thought of these things not with regret or lingering anxiety, but with quiet gratitude, understanding now, with the clarity that time and happiness had provided, that sometimes the most ordinary moments carried within them the seeds of transformations no one could have predicted, and that courage, offered honestly in even the smallest of gestures, had the power to reshape an entire life in ways that patient, careful calculation never could. A year after the wedding, Hannah returned to Ashworth Hall for the first time since becoming Duchess, invited by Clara to attend a small family gathering celebrating their mother's birthday. The visit felt strange at first, walking through the same halls where she had once scrubbed floors and carried heavy trays, now welcomed through the front entrance rather than the servants' door, greeted with careful courtesy by people who had once regarded her with open suspicion. Mrs. Ashworth, older now and visibly worn by the passing months, greeted her with a warmth that felt more genuine than anything Hannah had experienced from the woman during those difficult early weeks. Whether this softening came from true reconciliation or simple practical wisdom about maintaining good relations with a duchess, Hannah could not say for certain, and she found, to her own surprise, that she no longer particularly cared which explanation was true. Enough time had passed that she could extend simple kindness without needing to examine every motive behind the gestures offered in return. She sought out Cook in the kitchen before the formal gathering began, embracing the older woman warmly and listening with genuine interest to news of the household, of which maids had married and which had moved on to other positions, of the small, ordinary changes that had continued unfolding in her absence. It struck her, standing once more in that familiar kitchen, how completely her life had transformed in the space of a single year, and yet how comfortable and unchanged this particular room still felt, a reminder of the girl she had been before everything else began. Charlotte, now engaged herself to a respectable gentleman from a neighboring county, approached Hannah during the gathering with an awkward but genuine attempt at friendliness, the earlier hostility between them having faded into something that resembled, if not warmth, then at least mutual respect built on the passage of time and the settling of old grievances. Margaret, too, seemed to have found a measure of peace with how everything had unfolded, speaking with Hannah about ordinary matters, the weather, mutual acquaintances, the small pleasant nothings that mark a relationship no longer weighed down by resentment or rivalry. But it was Clara who remained closest to Hannah's heart, their friendship having only deepened in the year since the wedding, built on regular letters and occasional visits that neither of them ever seemed to tire of. As the birthday celebration wound toward evening, and Hannah prepared to return to Cavendon, Clara walked her out to the waiting carriage, linking arms with her as they had grown accustomed to doing during their conversations in the garden. "I am glad you came back," Clara said softly. "I know it cannot always be easy, returning to a place that once treated you so poorly." Hannah smiled, squeezing her friend's arm gently. "This house holds difficult memories, it is true. But it also holds you, and Cook, and the girl I once was, learning to be strong long before I understood why that strength would matter so much. I do not regret returning, not when it means seeing you." As the carriage pulled away down the familiar drive, past the hedges and the old stone gate where a duke's carriage had once departed, leaving behind nothing but quiet speculation, Hannah looked back at the house one final time, feeling not the fear or uncertainty that had once accompanied her every thought of that place, but something closer to peace, the settled contentment of a woman who had faced the hardest trial of her young life and emerged, against every reasonable expectation, exactly where she was always meant to be.